Hello everybody and welcome to this video, the continuation in my series on an inspector calls. Everything you see in this video comes from Mr. Bruff's Guide to an Inspector Calls, available at mrbruff.com and on Amazon for £3.99. So continuing with the summaries of each act and also giving some analysis in these videos as well, we're up to Act 2. So make sure that you've been looking at the playlist that this video is part of, and it is actually a really good way to search through my videos and see what's there through looking at the playlists. So Act 2 begins in the same way that Act 1 ends, with the inspector repeating his one-word question, "Well?" And the question is aimed at Gerald, who so far admitted he did have an affair with Eva, who he knew as Daisy Renton, the previous summer. Now Gerald tries to stop Sheila from hearing the details, claiming she was suffering enough already, and she insists on staying. And at the time the play is set, women were thought of as delicate, fragile creatures who should be protected, and Sheila proves that they can withstand traumatic events and can learn from their mistakes, a point Priestley was trying to raise when writing the play. After all, Eva hasn't been spared any upset or pain in the years leading up to her death. Now, the inspector highlights the idea of shared responsibility. If Sheila is sent away, she'll be alone with her feelings of guilt, so she is allowed to stay. Mrs. Birling notes how upset Sheila is and how affected she has been by the revelations. When talking about learning from their mistakes and accepting responsibility, the inspector comments on how young ones are more impressionable. Now, there is a whole video on old versus young in this playlist, so make sure that you watch that. Before this full story of Gerald's relationship with Eva or Daisy is revealed, Mrs. Birling's relationship with Eric is explored. She doesn't want to listen to the suggestion that Eric drinks too much. It seems even Gerald knows more about her son than she does. And this distance in their relationship, which is evident here in Act 2, sets up the episode later in the play when Mrs. Birling inadvertently tells the inspector that the father of Eva's child is to blame for the young girl's desperate situation. Mrs. Birling doesn't realise at the time that she is in fact blaming her own son. Mr. Birling tries to get the inspector to question Eric at this point so that he can get it over and done with and go to bed, but the inspector refuses, again ensuring his complete control over the situation and the order of revelations. Sheila clearly recognises the power of the inspector and how they're really at his mercy. Mr. and Mrs. Birling are less keen to see this as the case and try to regain control wherever they see the opportunity. The attention then returns back to Gerald, who's forced to tell the story of his contribution to the tragic chain of events that led to the demise of Eva. After a brief moment trying to deny his involvement again, Gerald admits that he met her in the bar at the Palace Variety Theatre, a place known to be the hangout of prostitutes, but he says that Daisy, as he knew her, looked different to those girls. She seemed to have a youthful, innocent look which made her stand out. Eric later reveals he almost met Eva in the same bar, and he also met Eva in the same bar, and also noticed how she stood out in comparison to the other women there. Not going to make Eva feel very good, is it? Gerald explains that Daisy was being harassed by Alderman Meggerty at the time he first saw her, and says he wanted to help her out, so he took her to the county hotel where they had a drink and talked. Gerald asked Daisy lots of questions about her background and learned of her sacking from both Birling and Company and Millwoods, although she was vague about the actual company names because, of course, if he'd heard Birling, it would have tipped him off that perhaps he should get out of there. He also worked out that she was struggling for money, so he arranged for some food to be brought to her. Now, 2 nights later, Gerald agreed to meet Daisy again, found her somewhere to live, and ended up having a relationship with her. He says that he didn't arrange the accommodation of her just so that he could have an affair with her. He says, "I didn't ask for anything in return." When questioned about the closeness of their relationship, Gerald isn't clear about whether or not he was in love with Daisy. He suggests her feelings for him were stronger than his towards her. It was only when he had to go away on business that Gerald broke up with her, gave her some money to ensure that she could manage on her own for a while, and didn't know exactly what her plans were, but his belief that she left Brumley is confirmed by Inspector Gould, who says that according to her diary she went to the seaside to think of Gerald and remember the positive aspects of the relationship. At this point, of course, Sheila, having heard all of this, hands Gerald back the engagement ring. It seems that both Sheila and Gerald regret their actions, and while she recognises he was trying to help Daisy, she doesn't feel their relationship is in the same place it was at the start of the evening. Gerald leaves the house and goes for a walk, and there's analysis of Gerald in the ebook. It seems that Gerald is never shown a photograph of Eva/Daisy, but Mrs. Birling is, and she says she doesn't recognise the girl in the picture. The inspector insists she must know the girl, at which Mr. Birling interrupts and demands an apology, and Mr. Birling again tries to use his social standing to exert authority over the inspector. He is sharply reminded that public men have responsibility as well as privileges. Priestley's key message of social responsibility is emphasised at every opportunity, usually using Inspector Gould to clearly voice those opinions. Sheila then accepts the need for them all to admit their guilt. She recaps the chain of events so far: Eva's sacking from Birling and Company, her sacking from Millward's, and her relationship with Gerald, which came to an end. She advises her mother to confess to her role, and the inspector's interrogation of Mrs. Birling begins. Mrs. Birling admits, after a prompting by the inspector, that she saw Eva Smith 2 weeks ago. Eva had tried to get help from the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation, of which Mrs. Birling is an important member. Eva's name, however, wasn't clear, as when she first applied to the organisation she called herself Mrs. Birling, and the Mrs. Birling in real life, of course, Sheila's mother, took offence to this, believing perhaps Eva was just being rude, and she admits that this influenced her to refuse the girl help. Her own standing within the organisation meant that her will was granted and Eva was turned away. Now, Mrs. Birling adds detail to the story and explains that although Eva had pretended to be married, no doubt to the man who'd made her pregnant, Eric, Mrs. Birling soon figured out that she was in fact unmarried and hadn't left a husband who'd abandoned her, as she first said. She tries to avoid giving more specific details, insisting that she did nothing wrong, and Mrs. Birling does not accept any responsibility for any wrongdoing at all. It is as the inspector reminds the Birlings of the horrific nature of Eva's death that he adds even more drama by revealing that she was pregnant. Sheila, of course, is desperately upset by that information. Mr. Birling is concerned at first that the child belonged to Gerald, his potential son-in-law, and Mrs. Birling unknowingly blames her own son, Eric, when she says, "Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility." Back to the inspector then, he tries to emphasise how Mrs. Birling's refusal of help really did affect Eva badly. She'd been left alone, poor, and only needing advice and some money, but Mrs. Birling hadn't been willing to offer her anything, despite having children of her own. Even though she clearly understood the situation, Mrs. Birling shows no remorse whatsoever. Almost predictably by this stage, Mr. Birling is most worried about the effect the revelations might have on his reputation if the press found out. He is, after all, expecting a knighthood, and it seems he wouldn't want anything to harm his chances of receiving that award. Both Mr. and Mrs. Birling appear to be very selfish characters whose aim is only to protect themselves and their social status. Mrs. Birling attempts to deflect the attention from herself and onto other family members, suggesting it was her husband and daughter who forced Eva into unemployment, and that may have started the chain of events which ended in such a tragic way. There is then further explanation of Mrs. Birling's side of the story. She says Eva knew the father of her baby and that he'd given her money and offered to marry her, but she realised he wasn't mature enough for that sort of commitment. The suggestion by the inspector that Eva didn't take the money because it was stolen adds weight to the argument that Eva has morals and may help the audience feel further sympathy for her. If she could maintain her moral integrity throughout such a difficult time, why can't the Birlings and Gerald now admit to their poor behaviour and take responsibility for their actions. But Mrs. Birling repeatedly fails to show any remorse. She realises too late that the drunken youth she's been blaming for Eva's situation is actually her own son Eric, and Sheila becomes increasingly upset, and it's clear that she understands Eric's role in the chain of events. The act ends with Eric arriving. Now, thank you for watching the video. If you pick up the ebook, you will find that there is a quiz on each act in there too.